When homicide detectives are working on a case, the very first thing they do after identifying who the victim is learn everything about that person, including their social network. Who is their partner? Who are their friends? Who are the relatives? Who are the coworkers? And who might have a reason to hurt this person? When you don't have the identity of the person figured out, that sets you back huge because you can't do any of those steps. You have to switch up your whole technique of the investigation. And oftentimes, that's enough to make the case go cold. Thanks to organizations like the Doe Network, many dedicated detectives, DNA advancements, and even some online sleuths, people who have been John and Jane Does for years and decades are finally getting their identities back. But once they are identified, that's only part of the battle. Don't get me wrong, it's huge, it's exciting, but the investigation essentially starts from there. And it's not uncommon for these John and Jane Does who are finally identified after all these years to still have the actual homicide investigation on their case be cold. I have covered two such cases like this on my podcast, and one just came out this week. The first one I covered was Wilma June Nissen. Actually, I should say she's the most recent one I covered just this week, so definitely go check out her episode. This is Wilma right here, and Wilma had such an unfair life as she was getting started. She grew up with neglectful birth parents who really struggled. Her mom walked out on her when she was just 8 years old. And then when her father was in charge of caring for her and her little sister, he used to lock them in a closet while he would go to work for the day. After he lost his job, he and his two daughters were living out of his car, and poor Wilma, at 8 years old, was having to wander the streets begging for food for the family. She then ended up in a series of foster families and group homes, and then she grew up really fast, going into adult life, hitting the streets. She was engaging in sex work, she was involved in high risk relationships, and she really had a rough go of it. Wilma had three biological children, and they all ended up going into the foster care system. But her youngest, her name is Chrissy, and she's the one who reached out to me to cover her mother's case. Chrissy actually grew up being raised by the final foster family who raised Wilma. And she wanted to find out as much as she could about her mother, but after years and years and years, she really couldn't find much except for her name. She had no idea what happened to her after her mother left. In 2006, when Chrissy was really digging in and trying to find out more information, that is when she found out the tragic news that Wilma had just been identified as a homicide victim back in 1978. So it took 27 years for her to get her identity back. Back in 1978, Wilma was a Jane Doe in Lyon County, Iowa, a rural community just over the South Dakota border. Wilma had been found on this stretch of road in rural Lyon County in the fall of 1978. A man was laying down cable and stumbled across her body. She was found with ropes around her ankles, and she was wearing knee-high go-go boots. And actually, the way that she was identified was because a fingerprint that they took during her autopsy was matched to a thumbprint from a police booking card for sex work back in Los Angeles in the 1970s. She actually had the nickname Boots. It was listed as one of her aliases. So it was actually just extra chilling that that's how she was found, with her boots like that, because that's what she was known by. As investigators traced her steps and tried to figure out how she landed in Iowa, they realized that she had been working for an escort service out of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. This one right here, the Playgirls Escort Service, and that there was a lot of kind of dangerous people involved with that. One such person was someone named Sugar. That's what she went by, and she also worked for the escort service, and this is her in the late 1970s. In around 2016, 2017, police came forth with this information. They actually released her picture to the media, and they said they knew who Sugar was. They had interviewed her. She had denied involvement, but they actually named her as a suspect. What they're still looking for is people who knew her during this time, who can corroborate some of their theories, who can put information together, who can help them piece together what might have happened. They also said that there is another woman named another woman who went by the name Peaches. Sorry about that. And Peaches is someone who they weren't able to identify. They know she is a light-skinned Black woman who was from Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. And they said that Sugar and Peaches, that they were known to rob not only clients of the escort service, but fellow girls who worked in the escort service with them. There's a theory that that is what potentially happened here with Wilma, and that maybe she fought back too hard and she ended up dead. But they are trying to piece that together. They're looking for anybody who may have known her, anybody who attended these parties. That's where it left off. So, I mean, this is someone, they know who this is and they really think she's involved, but they just need information to corroborate that. Chrissy is eager to find information out in her mother's case, and I tell the full story on the podcast. This is just a little snippet. Chrissy joined me for this week's episode, so please go check out A Simpler Time True Crime. It is the most recent episode, and that is where I cover Wilma's case. It's so helpful to share this episode because Chrissy is not just looking for answers in her mother's death. That's certainly her primary focus, but she's also looking for people who maybe even just knew her mother in any capacity so she can learn more about her. And there are some relatives that she's looking for. So I mention all of that in the podcast and who you can reach out to. The other Jane Doe case that I covered on my podcast was the case of Tammy Jo Alexander. Tammy Jo Alexander was a 16-year-old girl who fled Florida and a difficult home life in the 1970s looking for something else out there. She kept in touch with a boyfriend for a while. She would send him cassette tapes and letters, but she sort of fell off the grid with everybody, and people just assumed that she ran away and started a new life. So, like Wilma June Nissen, Tammy Jo Alexander was never reported missing. In November of 1979, Tammy Jo was found deceased in a cornfield in the community of Caledonia, New York. It's south of Rochester, New York. And she had been shot in the back of the head. Police felt that she never even saw it coming. Despite being this young girl, nobody seemed to be looking for her, and they could not figure out her identity. She even had some unique jewelry. She had been wearing this as her jewelry, and they actually were able to figure out that the top one was something that was found at throughway rest stops. Like, you put a little quarter in the machine and you get out this little heart-shaped jewelry. So they couldn't really trace that to anything meaningful. She also had on this racing jacket that was pretty unique, so they did a lot of work on that, including pollen that was found on it. They were able to try to trace where that pollen was from to see where she was from, and it was potentially a few different, much warmer than New York states. So places like Florida and Texas and parts of California is where that certain pollen that was found on the jacket was traced back to. So when I say these investigators tried to pull out all the stops, they really did. They actually went through the stomach contents during her autopsy, and they realized that she ate a special from the Lima Diner, and the Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester, New York ended up recreating what her last meal looked like. A waitress did spot the man and the woman, and the woman being Tammy Jo Alexander. She remembered them and she did a composite sketch. But like many composite sketches, it was not great. It wasn't until the 2010s when an old high school friend began looking for her and connected with one of Tammy Jo's sisters. Together, they realized she was never reported missing. They reported her missing, and that's when she was entered into the databases. And an online sleuther who specialized in connecting John and Jane Does with missing persons, Carl Koppelman, he was actually responsible for helping to identify her. Now, as great as it is that she has been identified, her killer is still out there. So just one piece of her investigation is solved, and she deserves answers as well. So Wilma June Nissen and Tammy Jo Alexander. Tammy Jo Alexander was one of my first episodes, episode 7. So please check out A Simpler Time True Crime Podcast for the full episodes on both.